Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. My name is Graham Holloway, and before everything changed in the summer of 2021, I spent 15 years of my life guiding hunting parties through the backcountry around Aztec, New Mexico. The work defined me, tracking elk through pine forests, teaching city folks how to read animal sign, sleeping under stars so thick they looked like spilled salt. Then came the divorce in early 2020, draining my bank account and whatever optimism I'd managed to save up. By spring of 2021, I'd traded my guide license for a job selling camping equipment and hunting supplies to tourists who'd never fire a shot outside a range. The work paid enough to cover rent on a studio apartment that smelled like someone else's cigarettes, but it hollowed me out in ways I didn't expect. Every morning I'd wake to the same water-stained ceiling, brew the same weak coffee, and drive the same route to a store where I answered the same questions about tent stakes and propane canisters. I was 42 years old, and felt like I'd already seen my best days disappear in the rearview mirror. That's the state I was in when Dr. Victoria Lang called on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. She introduced herself as a paleontologist from the University of Wisconsin, and she needed a guide for a fossil survey near Navajo Dam. The area she wanted to explore was a stretch of exposed badlands the locals called Hogback, a maze of sandstone ridges and dry washes that most people avoided. The terrain was brutal, the kind of place where you could twist an ankle or get turned around if you didn't know what you were doing. But I knew it. I'd hunted those ridges for years. Dr. Lang's voice was professional and direct. She explained that recent spring runoff had exposed new geological layers, potentially revealing fossils from the late Cretaceous period. She needed someone who could navigate the unmarked territory and keep her small research team safe for 3 days in the field. When she mentioned her budget, $1,200 plus expenses, I accepted before she finished the sentence. It was more money than I'd see in 2 weeks at the hardware store, and frankly I missed the backcountry more than I wanted to admit. We arranged to meet that Friday morning at 6. I spent the next 2 days gathering supplies, checking my old equipment, and trying to remember the exact route into Hogback. The area had changed since I'd last been there in 2018. Seasonal flooding had carved new patterns into the landscape, and the BLM had closed several access roads after budget cuts eliminated regular maintenance. I studied topographic maps by lamplight, tracing possible routes with my finger, feeling something I hadn't felt in months, a sense of purpose. Friday arrived cold and clear. Dr. Lang showed up in a white rental SUV with Colorado plates, accompanied by her research assistant. She was in her mid-50s, with steel gray hair pulled into a practical braid and the weathered complexion of someone who spent more time outdoors than in lecture halls. Her handshake was firm, her eyes sharp and evaluating. The research assistant introduced himself as Byron Walsh, a graduate student from Milwaukee working on his dissertation. Byron was young, maybe 26, with pale skin that looked like it rarely saw sun and hands that trembled slightly when we shook. He laughed nervously when I asked if he'd done much hiking, admitting this was his first time in desert terrain. We loaded gear into my truck, a 2003 Ford F-150 with rust spots and a rebuilt transmission that still ran strong. Dr. Lang had brought professional surveying equipment, cameras, sample collection tools, and enough academic enthusiasm to fill 3 expeditions. Byron carried a backpack that looked too new, tags still attached to some of the straps. I made a mental note to watch him closely. The desert didn't care about good intentions or academic credentials. The drive took us west from Aztec, following Highway 550 before turning onto a dirt access road that hadn't seen grading in years. Potholes jarred the suspension, and dust billowed behind us in thick clouds. We passed through open rangeland where cattle grazed near windmills, then climbed into rougher country where juniper trees grew twisted and sparse, clinging to rocky soil. The landscape felt vast and indifferent, beautiful in a harsh way that most people found unsettling. After 40 minutes we reached the trailhead, or what used to be a trailhead. The official BLM marker post stood at an angle, sun-bleached and barely legible. Sagebrush had reclaimed most of the parking area, and the trail itself had vanished beneath years of erosion and neglect. Byron stared at the empty landscape with visible concern. "This is it?" he asked, his voice higher than normal. "Used to be," I replied, cutting the engine. Trail washed out a few years back. Nobody maintains it anymore. I watched their faces carefully, giving them a chance to back out. Dr. Lang simply nodded and began unloading her equipment. All business. Byron swallowed hard but followed her lead, trying to mask his nervousness with activity. We distributed gear, filled water bladders, checked GPS units, and reviewed emergency protocols. I made sure both of them understood that cell service was non-existent out here, and if something went wrong, we'd be on our own until we hiked back to the truck. By 7:30, we were walking. The terrain unfolded in layers of sedimentary rock, each stratum a different shade of red, orange, or gray. Juniper trees dotted the hillsides, their trunks gnarled and twisted by constant wind. The earth beneath our boots was a mixture of sand, shale, and crumbled stone that shifted with every step. Heat rose quickly as the sun climbed higher, turning the air dry enough to crack lips and parch throats within the first mile. Dr. Lang moved with surprising stamina, stopping frequently to examine rock faces and take notes. Byron struggled more, unused to the altitude and the weight of his pack. I set a moderate pace, pausing often to let him catch his breath without making it obvious. Every so often I'd scan the horizon, checking landmarks against my memory of the area. The landscape felt familiar but subtly wrong, like returning to a childhood home and finding the furniture rearranged. We walked for hours through that empty country. The silence was immense, broken only by the crunch of boots on stone and the occasional cry of a raven circling overhead. No highways, no aircraft, no distant machinery. Just wind and rock and the vast blue sky pressing down on us. It was the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breath, the small sounds of your body moving through space. Around noon, we stopped for lunch in the shade of a tall rock fin. I rationed out water carefully, knowing from experience how quickly dehydration could turn dangerous out here. Byron drank too fast, gulping down half his supply before I reminded him to pace himself. Dr. Lang pulled out her geological survey maps, comparing them to GPS coordinates and making annotations with a pencil. She seemed energized by the landscape, pointing out fossil beds and explaining how ancient seas had once covered this entire region millions of years ago. I listened with half attention, my focus drifting to the surrounding terrain. We'd entered a section of hogback I remembered only vaguely, a network of narrow ravines and steep-walled canyons that dead-ended frequently, forcing you to backtrack and find alternate routes. The rock formations here were dramatic, layers of sandstone and shale tilted at severe angles, creating knife-edge ridges and deep shadows even in direct sunlight. It was stunning country, but it had always made me uneasy in ways I couldn't articulate. Too many blind corners, too many places where visibility dropped to nothing. We resumed hiking, descending into a wide wash that curved between high walls. The sand here was fine and deep, making every step an effort. Byron's breathing grew labored, his face flushed red beneath a sheen of sweat. I slowed the pace further, allowing more frequent rest stops. Dr. Lang seemed oblivious to the difficulty, her attention fixed on the exposed geological layers in the canyon walls. By mid-afternoon, I'd found a suitable campsite, a protected alcove beneath a limestone overhang that offered shelter and a clear view of the surrounding area. A flat shelf of rock provided space for tents, and a nearby depression in the stone held rainwater that hadn't yet evaporated. I tested the water quality, found it acceptable, and began setting up camp while Dr. Lang and Byron explored the immediate vicinity. The sun was low when they returned, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. Byron looked exhausted, barely able to keep his eyes open as he helped gather firewood. We built a small fire using dried juniper branches and scraps of bark, the smoke rising straight up in the still evening air. I prepared a simple meal of dehydrated stew and instant coffee, and we ate in comfortable silence as daylight faded into dusk. Stars emerged one by one, then by the thousands spreading across the sky in a luminous band that stretched horizon to horizon. The Milky Way appeared so dense and bright it cast faint shadows. Byron stared upward with genuine wonder, momentarily forgetting his exhaustion. Dr. Lang made notes by headlamp, documenting the day's observations and planning tomorrow's survey route. I sat apart from them, my back against the alcove wall, watching the fire burn down to coals. Something felt off, though I couldn't identify what exactly. Maybe it was the absolute absence of sound. No insects, no distant coyotes, nothing. Or maybe it was the bones I'd noticed scattered around the camp perimeter while setting up tents. Cattle bones, I'd assumed at first, bleached white by sun and weather. but examining them more closely had revealed something strange. They were too clean, stripped of every trace of tissue without any evidence of scavengers. No tooth marks, no claw scrapes, no signs of the usual feeding patterns I'd seen countless times before. Just clean white bone partially buried in sand. I didn't mention it to the others. No point in creating worry over something that probably had a simple explanation. Cattle died out here regularly, victims of drought or disease or simple bad luck. The bones meant nothing. Still, I kept my revolver close as I settled into my sleeping bag, the weight of it reassuring beneath my makeshift pillow. Sleep came slowly that first night, so I lay on my back staring up at the rock ceiling of the alcove, listening to Byron's soft snoring and Dr. Lang's quiet breathing. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, providing just enough light to see the rough outlines of our camp. My body was tired from the long hike, but my mind wouldn't quiet down, circling back repeatedly to those scattered bones and the unnatural silence surrounding us. Around midnight, I heard something that made my eyes snap open. Footsteps. Not the scuffing, irregular sounds of an animal moving through brush, but deliberate steps on stone and packed sand. Slow, measured, methodical. The rhythm was too steady, too careful. Something was circling our camp, moving along the perimeter just beyond the reach of the firelight's dying glow. I remained motionless, barely breathing, straining to hear more clearly. The steps continued, left to right, then back again, pacing in a wide arc around the alcove. My hand slid slowly beneath my sleeping bag until my fingers closed around the grip of my revolver. The metal felt cold against my palm, grounding me. The footsteps stopped directly opposite my position, maybe 30 yards out. I waited, counting my own heartbeats, wondering if I should wake the others. But what would I tell them? That I heard something walking. In the morning they'd chalk it up to nerves or imagination, and maybe they'd be right. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the steps resumed, completing their circuit and fading gradually into the distance. I sat up slowly, thumb finding the release on my headlamp. With one quick motion, I clicked it on and swept the beam across the surrounding darkness. Nothing. Just empty desert, shadowed rock formations and the dark shapes of scattered juniper trees. No movement, no reflected eyeshine, no sign that anything had been there at all. I kept the light on for several minutes, examining every shadow and hollow, but the landscape remained still and lifeless. Eventually, I turned off the headlamp and lay back down, but sleep was impossible now. I remained awake until the first gray light of dawn began seeping into the eastern sky. The revolver gripped loosely in my right hand, my jaw clenched tight enough to make my teeth ache. When morning finally arrived, I felt hollowed out and jittery from lack of sleep. I built up the fire and started coffee while Dr. Lang emerged from her tent, stretching and commenting on how well she'd slept. Byron's tent remained closed, the zipper still fastened. "Byron?" Dr. Lang called, her voice still rough with sleep. "We should get an early start if we want to cover the survey area." No response. She called again, louder this time, moving toward his tent. I stood slowly, that familiar sense of wrongness settling into my gut like cold lead. Dr. Lang reached for the zipper, pulling it down quickly. The tent was empty. Byron's sleeping bag lay twisted and empty, the interior still holding the shape of his body. His boots sat neatly beside the tent entrance, laces tied. His backpack leaned against the alcove wall exactly where he'd left it the night before. His jacket hung from a tent stake, undisturbed. Everything was there except Byron himself. Dr. Lang's face went pale. "Byron," she shouted, her voice cracking slightly. "Byron, where are you?" I stepped past her, examining the ground around his tent. The sand held no clear prints, but I noticed several scuff marks leading away from the campsite, disappearing into the shadows of the wash. My stomach tightened. Byron wouldn't have wandered off barefoot in this terrain. Not willingly. "Maybe he went to relieve himself," Dr. Lang said, but her tone betrayed her doubt. We searched the immediate area, calling his name repeatedly. Our voices echoed off the canyon walls, bouncing back in hollow mockery. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. The sun rose higher, heating the rocks and filling the wash with harsh light that created deep contrasting shadows. I grabbed my binoculars and climbed to a higher vantage point, scanning the surrounding terrain systematically. Desert stretched in every direction. Rock fins, scattered vegetation, the distant dark line of a ravine cutting through the landscape. Nothing moved except the slight shimmer of heat rising from sun-warmed stone. Then I saw it. About 200 yards away, down in a narrow ravine choked with dead juniper, something stood upright among the twisted branches. I adjusted the focus, bringing the image into sharp clarity, and felt my blood turn cold. It was Byron. His body stood rigidly against a juniper trunk, arms hanging at unnatural angles, head tilted back at a degree that should have been impossible without breaking his neck. Even from this distance, even through the binoculars' distortion, I could see that something was profoundly wrong with the way he was positioned. His bare feet didn't quite touch the ground. He was propped, displayed, positioned with deliberate care. "Dr. Lang," I called down, my voice steady despite the ice spreading through my chest. "I found him." She scrambled up beside me, and I handed her the binoculars. Pointing toward the ravine, she looked, sucked in a sharp breath, and nearly dropped the binoculars. Her hand flew to her mouth. We descended from the alcove and made our way toward the ravine, moving carefully down a steep embankment of loose shale. My legs felt mechanical, disconnected from conscious thought. Part of me wanted to turn around, to leave Byron where he was, and get as far away from this place as possible. But I kept moving forward, Dr. Lang close behind me, both of us silent except for the sound of our boots on stone. When we reached the ravine bottom, we had to push through thick brush to reach him. And then we were standing there, 3 feet away from Byron's body, and the full horror of it crashed over me like cold water. His eyes were gone. Not torn out or damaged, simply absent. The sockets were clean and empty, dark hollows staring blindly upward at the morning sky. His skin was pale gray, drained completely of color. His mouth hung slightly open in an expression that wasn't quite fear, wasn't quite surprise, but something else entirely. Something that suggested he'd seen something his mind couldn't process in those final moments. But the worst part, the detail that made my hands shake and my breathing turn shallow, was the complete absence of blood. No wounds, no scratches, no signs of struggle. His body was pristine except for those empty eye sockets. The ground beneath him was undisturbed, unmarked. No tracks, no drag marks, nothing to indicate how he'd gotten here, or what had done this to him. Dr. Lang made a sound between a sob and a gasp. She turned away, pressing both hands against her face, shoulders shaking. I forced myself to look away from Byron and examine the surrounding area. The ravine was narrow, boxed in by high walls. Dead junipers choked the passage, their branches gray and brittle. In the sand I noticed more bones, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, partially buried and scattered throughout the ravine. Vertebrae, ribs, long bones from large animals, all of them cleaned completely, stripped of every trace of organic matter. "We need to leave," I said quietly. "Right now." Dr. Lang nodded without speaking, without looking back at Byron's body. We turned and climbed out of the ravine, moving faster than caution should have allowed, scraped our hands on rock and tore our clothes on dead branches in our haste to get away. When we reached the campsite, I started throwing gear into packs without bothering to organize anything properly. Tents could stay. The survey equipment could stay. None of it mattered anymore. We needed water, navigation tools, and distance from this place. Dr. Lang stood frozen, staring at Byron's empty tent. "We can't just leave him there," she whispered. "We can't help him," I replied, more harshly than intended. "And whatever did that to him might still be close." She opened her mouth to argue, but the words died before she could speak them. Because at that moment we both saw movement on the ridge above us. A figure stood silhouetted against the bright morning sky, approximately 300 yards away on the highest point of the surrounding ridge. It was naked, completely exposed to the harsh sunlight, and it stood with an unnatural stillness that immediately set every nerve in my body screaming. Even from that distance, even as a dark silhouette against the glare, I knew it was meant to look like Byron. Dr. Lang saw it too. Her breath caught, and she grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. We stood frozen, staring upward, as the figure began moving toward us. It didn't walk so much as glide, each step flowing into the next with an impossible smoothness. The movements were wrong, no hesitation, no accommodation for the rough terrain, no natural variation in gait, just steady, relentless forward motion. My hand moved to the revolver on my belt. fingers closing around the grip. The figure stopped immediately, as though it could sense the threat from hundreds of yards away. For a long moment, nothing moved. The desert held its collective breath. Then the figure tilted its head upward, and even from that distance I knew it was looking directly at me. Not at us, at me specifically. The recognition was visceral, undeniable, and as it tilted its head, I caught a glimpse of its face in the direct sunlight. The features were Byron's but stretched, elongated, the proportions subtly wrong in ways that my brain struggled to process. The mouth was too wide, pulled into something that might have been a smile but contained no warmth, no humanity. And the eyes, even from 300 yards away, I could see that the eyes were wrong. Too large, too dark, reflecting light in a way that made my stomach turn. Dr. Lang made a small, choked sound. Her fingers dug deeper into my arm. The figure took another step forward, then another. Each movement deliberate, testing, watching for our reaction. I slowly pulled the revolver free, keeping it pointed at the ground but visible. The figure paused again. "Get in the truck," I said quietly, not taking my eyes off the thing on the ridge. "But now." Dr. Lang released my arm and moved toward where we'd left our packs. I backed up slowly, maintaining eye contact with the figure, revolver held loosely at my side. The thing tilted its head the other direction, bird-like, curious. Then it raised one arm in what might have been a wave or might have been a beckoning gesture. I raised the revolver, pointing it directly at the figure. The response was immediate. It stepped backward smoothly, retreating into the shadows of a rock formation, and vanished from sight as though it had never been there at all. My hands were shaking badly now. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to think clearly despite the adrenaline flooding my system. Dr. Lang appeared beside me, both packs slung over her shoulders, her face the color of ash. "What was that?" she whispered. "I don't know. We're leaving." We hurried back toward the trailhead, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. Every few minutes I'd stop and scan behind us, checking for pursuit. The desert remained empty, silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, evaluated, studied by something that understood far more about us than we could ever understand about it. The hike out should have taken 4 hours. After 6 hours of pushing through the heat, scrambling over obstacles, and retracing our steps through identical-looking ravines, I had to accept the truth: we were lost. The landmarks I'd used to navigate on the way in had shifted or disappeared entirely. Rock formations that should have been on our left appeared on our right. Washes that had been dry now held standing water. The GPS unit showed us miles off course, impossibly far from where we should have been. None of it made sense. Dr. Lang was struggling, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her face dangerously flushed. We'd been rationing water, but the heat was brutal, and we'd sweated out more than we could safely afford to lose. I knew the signs of heat exhaustion, the confusion, the weakness, the headache that made thinking difficult. She needed shade, rest, and more water than we had. We stopped in the shadow of a massive boulder, and I made her drink half of my remaining water despite her protests. She slumped against the rock, eyes closed, while I tried to figure out where we'd gone wrong. The sun had passed its zenith, and was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. We had maybe 4 more hours of daylight, and then we'd be stuck out here in the dark with something that had already killed once. I was considering our options, none of them good, when I heard the sound of an engine. At first I thought it was dehydration playing tricks on my ears, but the sound grew louder, unmistakable, the diesel rattle of an old truck laboring over rough terrain. I stood quickly, scanning the landscape, and spotted a plume of dust rising from behind a nearby ridge. "Someone's here," I said, helping Dr. Lang to her feet. "Come on." We scrambled up a rocky slope toward the sound, moving with desperate energy we shouldn't have had left. At the crest, we saw it. An ancient pickup truck, faded blue paint almost completely obscured by dust and rust, bumping along what might have been a service road, or might have just been a dried stream bed. I waved both arms over my head, shouting. The truck slowed, then stopped. For a terrible moment, I thought the driver might turn around and leave us there. But then the vehicle shifted into reverse, backing up until it was level with our position. The driver's side window rolled down with a mechanical whine. The man behind the wheel was older, probably in his 70s, with weathered brown skin and deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. He wore a faded denim shirt and a stained baseball cap. His expression was neutral, unreadable, but his eyes moved from my face to the revolver still holstered at my hip. "You two need help," he stated flatly. It wasn't a question. Yes, I managed. My voice cracked and hoarse. We got turned around. "My friend needs water." He nodded once, then reached across and opened the passenger door. "Get in." We climbed into the truck, Dr. Lang collapsing onto the cracked leather bench seat. The interior smelled like old tobacco, dust, and something else. Sage, maybe, or juniper smoke. The old man handed us a plastic water jug without a word, and we drank gratefully. He put the truck in gear and started driving, navigating the rough terrain with practiced ease. I waited for him to ask questions. Why we were out here, what had happened, where we needed to go, but he remained silent, eyes fixed on the path ahead. After nearly 20 minutes, when we'd covered enough distance that I no longer felt the immediate pressure of panic, I finally spoke. "Thank you," I said. Something happened out there, something bad." The old man nodded slowly but didn't respond. We drove in silence for another mile before he finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "That area doesn't get used anymore. Not for years now." I waited, sensing there was more. "Last cattle went down there in 2017, he continued. "Rancher lost 30 head in 2 weeks. Found them arranged in patterns, clean bones, no blood." He paused, shifting gears as we climbed a steep incline. After that, we stopped going down there. My throat had gone dry again despite the water. "What did it?" The old man's jaw tightened. He took a long moment before answering. "Some of the elders have names for it. Different tribes, different languages, but the same idea, a thing that walks in daylight now. Used to only come out at night, but that was a long time ago." He glanced at me briefly, then back to the road. "You didn't shoot at it, did you?" "No," I whispered. "Almost did, but no." "Good," he nodded approvingly. "Never shoot at something that doesn't leave tracks. Bullets just make it angry." We drove for what felt like hours through that empty country, following dirt roads that barely qualified as paths. The old man navigated with the confidence of someone who'd spent his entire life in this landscape, reading subtle variations in terrain that I couldn't even perceive. Dr. Lang had fallen into an exhausted sleep against the window, her breathing finally steady and regular. I wanted to ask more questions, what the thing was, where it came from, why it had taken Byron, but something in the old man's posture discouraged conversation. He drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes constantly scanning the landscape, as though expecting something to appear at any moment. Eventually, the terrain began to smooth out. We intersected with a maintained gravel road, then paved highway, and finally we pulled into a small gas station on the outskirts of Blanco. The sun was low on the horizon, painting the western sky in shades of orange and deep red. The old man put the truck in park, but left the engine running. He turned to face me directly for the first time, and I saw something in his eyes that made me go still. Not fear exactly, but a deep wariness, the kind that comes from knowledge that costs too much. "What happened to your friend?" he said quietly. "That's what it does. It takes someone, wears them like clothing, studies how they move, how they speak, gets better at pretending each time." He paused. "Used to be, it would make mistakes. Move wrong, speak wrong. People would know something was off, but it's been learning for a long time now." "How long?" I asked. He shook his head. "Longer than anyone remembers. The elders say it's always been here, in one form or another. Sometimes it goes quiet for years, decades even. Then something brings it back. Tourists, usually. People who don't know better." Dr. Lang stirred in her sleep but didn't wake. The old man glanced at her, then back to me. "You should go home," he said. "Both of you. Forget what you saw out there. Don't talk about it. Don't write about it. Don't try to make sense of it. Some things are better left alone." "What about Byron?" I asked. "What about his body?" The old man's expression softened slightly. "The body's just meat now. What made him a person is already gone. If you send people looking for him, they'll disappear too. That's how it works. It waits, watches, and when someone comes close, it takes them." He reached across and opened my door. "Best thing you can do is leave and never come back." We climbed out of the truck, and I reached for my wallet. intending to offer him money for gas and his time. He waved me off with a sharp gesture. "No payment," he said firmly. "Just remember what I told you. And tell your friend when she wakes up some places belong to things older than us. We're just visitors here, passing through. Don't forget that." Before I could respond, he shifted into drive and pulled away, leaving us standing in the parking lot as twilight deepened into darkness. The gas station's fluorescent lights flickered on automatically, harsh and artificial after days in the desert. A car drove past on the highway, its headlights sweeping across us briefly before continuing into the night. Dr. Lang woke slowly, disoriented and confused. I helped her inside the gas station, bought her water and food, and called a cab to take us back to Aztec. She didn't speak much, still processing everything that had happened. I didn't push her. What could either of us say that would make any difference? The cab ride passed in silence. When we reached town, Dr. Lang had me drop her at the rental SUV. We stood in the parking lot for a moment, neither of us quite able to make eye contact. "What do we tell people?" she asked finally. "About Byron?" "The truth," I said. "We got separated during the hike. Despite searching, we couldn't find him. We had to leave when our supplies ran out." "That's not the truth." "It's close enough." She nodded slowly, accepting this. "I'm leaving tonight, driving straight to Albuquerque, catching the first flight out tomorrow morning." "Good idea. What about you?" I looked up at the night sky, at the stars beginning to emerge between clouds.
"I live here. This is my home."
"I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for bringing you out there. For Byron." "Not your fault," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it. She drove away without another word. I watched her taillights disappear around a corner, then walked the remaining blocks to my apartment, too tired and too numb to think clearly. I called in sick to work for the next 3 days, spending the time mostly in bed, curtains drawn, trying to convince myself that life could return to some kind of normal. It didn't work. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Byron's empty socket staring up at nothing, or the thing on the fourth day, I got a call from the San Juan County Sheriff's Office. Dr. Lang had filed a missing persons report for Byron Walsh before leaving the state. A deputy wanted to take my statement, to understand what had happened during our hiking trip. I met him at the station and gave him this. The deputy was professional and thorough, taking detailed notes and asking all the right questions. He wanted exact coordinates, descriptions of the terrain, specifics about our search patterns. I provided what I could. A search and rescue team went out 5 days later. They found our abandoned campsite, Byron's unused equipment, but no trace of Byron himself. The ravine where Dr. Lang never called or emailed. I didn't reach out to her either. We had an unspoken agreement that some experiences were better left unexamined, some questions better left unasked. 2 weeks after everything happened, I took all my camping and hiking equipment out behind the hardware store. Sleeping bags, tent, backpack, maps, compass, water filters, everything. I piled it all into a rusted oil drum and doused it with lighter fluid. The fire burned hot and fast, sending thick black smoke spiraling into the evening sky. I stood watching until nothing remained but melted plastic, charred fabric, and warped metal glowing dull red in the gathering darkness. The next day, I gave notice at the hardware store. 2 weeks later, I moved to Farmington, 30 miles away, and took a job doing inventory management for a tool distributor. Inside work, fluorescent lights, concrete floors, no windows looking out at wild spaces. I haven't guided since. Haven't hiked, haven't camped, haven't set foot off maintained trails or paved roads. When people ask why I gave up guiding, I tell them I got too old for it, or that the market dried up, or that my knees can't handle the terrain anymore. They accept these explanations without question. The truth is simpler and more complicated than any excuse. I know now that there are places humans aren't meant to go, things we aren't meant to see. The desert around Aztec still calls to me sometimes. I'll catch a glimpse of distant ridges from the highway, or smell juniper smoke on the wind, and feel that old familiar pull, but I've learned to ignore it. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if the thing is still out there in the hogback, waiting in those empty canyons for the next person who wanders too far off the trail. I wonder how many people it's taken over the years, how many missing hikers and hunters disappeared into that landscape without leaving a trace. I wonder if it's still learning, still perfecting its imitation of human behavior, getting better at pretending with each victim. But mostly, I try not to wonder at all. I focus on the concrete reality of inventory spreadsheets, shipping manifests, and purchase orders. I stay in well-lit places, surrounded by people. I've learned to appreciate walls and locked doors, the comforting hum of electricity, the reassuring presence of civilization. The old man was right. Some places belong to things older than us. Some territories are marked by boundaries we can't see but would be wise to respect. The desert doesn't care about our curiosity, our academic interests, our need to understand. It exists on terms that predate human language, human logic, human morality. I survived my encounter with whatever lives in the hogback, but I didn't escape unchanged. Byron's empty eyes still visit me in dreams. The figure on the ridge still tilts its head in my peripheral vision sometimes, watching with impossible patience. And on certain nights when the wind blows from the west, I swear I can hear footsteps circling my apartment, slow and steady and deliberate, pacing the perimeter just beyond the reach of the security lights. I lock my doors, I keep the blinds drawn, and I remember the old man's final warning. We're just visitors here, passing through. I don't plan on visiting that particular territory again. Last summer, I made the decision to venture into the MSD wilderness, deep in the heart of Florida's Everglades. It was late July, the kind of oppressive heat that makes the air shimmer and distort above the dirt trails. I had been hiking for nearly 4 hours, my boots caked with mud and debris, my shirt soaked through with sweat that wouldn't evaporate in the thick humidity. The weight of my pack dug into my shoulders with familiar pressure, but I welcomed it. This was my ritual, my escape from the constant digital noise of modern life. I'd done dozens of these solo expeditions over the years, each one a chance to silence the chaos and reconnect with something primal and honest. The trail stretched ahead of me, winding through dense palmetto scrub and stands of cypress trees, whose gnarled roots rose from the dark water like arthritic fingers. Spanish moss hung in gray curtains from the branches, and the wet earth released its ancient smell with every footfall. Mosquitoes whined around my ears despite the repellent I'd slathered on my exposed skin. My water bottle was nearly empty, warm from the heat, but I rationed it carefully. I knew these trails well enough to trust my navigation, to know where the next reliable water source would be. The deeper I pushed into the wilderness, the more the familiar sounds of the Everglades surrounded me. Frogs croaked in rhythmic chorus from hidden pools. Birds called to each other in languages I couldn't understand but found comforting nonetheless. Somewhere in the distance, an alligator bellowed, that prehistoric rumble that reminded me I was far from civilization. This was exactly what I needed: solitude, challenge, and the raw honesty of nature where nothing pretended to be anything other than what it was. After a while, something changed. It started as a low hum somewhere off to my left, initially so subtle that I almost dismissed it as my imagination or the blood rushing through my ears from exertion. It reminded me of a distant lawnmower, that mechanical drone that carries across suburban neighborhoods on weekend mornings. But this was the Everglades, miles from any maintained property or human habitation. The sound didn't belong here. I stopped walking, tilting my head to listen more carefully. My breathing had grown ragged from the pace I'd been maintaining, so I focused on slowing it down, trying to isolate the noise from the natural ambient sounds of the wetlands. Insects were obviously everywhere out here, a constant presence that you learn to ignore or go mad from their incessant noise. But what I was hearing that day felt fundamentally different from the usual buzz of mosquitoes or the electric hum of cicadas. The sound grew steadily louder. It developed into a steady thrum that I could feel as much as hear. A vibration that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity like standing too close to a bass speaker. My hand instinctively went to my sternum, pressing against the bone as if I could somehow muffle the sensation from the inside. The hair on my forearm stood up, and a trickle of sweat ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the oppressive heat. I scanned the trees and bushes around me, searching for the source. The canopy above filtered the harsh sunlight into a greenish gloom that made everything look slightly unreal. Shadows pooled in the undergrowth, and my eyes darted from one dark spot to another, expecting something to leap out at any moment, but there was nothing visible. Just the empty sky above me visible through gaps in the foliage, just the unmoving vegetation, and that noise getting impossibly louder as whatever was making it drew closer and closer. The sound intensified until it felt like it was right on top of me, so loud now that it drowned out every other noise in the Everglades. My hands had gone numb, and I realized I was holding my breath. Every muscle in my body tensed as if preparing for impact. Then suddenly, I saw it. It was a beetle, but calling it simply a beetle felt inadequate, like calling a tsunami a wave. This thing was massive, easily the size of a football as it burst from the tree line about 20 yards away. It moved through the air with surprising speed, banking and turning with predatory grace before starting to fly in circles directly above my head. The sound it made was unlike anything I'd ever heard from an insect. It was a chattering, buzzing noise that reminded me of hornets, but deeper, more resonant, and infinitely more unsettling. The pitch fluctuated as it flew, creating an almost musical quality that made my teeth ache. I remember freezing on the spot, my neck craning awkwardly as I tracked its movement above me. My hiking poles had fallen from my slack fingers and lay forgotten on the trail. In all my years hiking these wilderness areas, I'd encountered plenty of unusual wildlife. I'd seen gnarly-looking stag beetles with mandibles like tree branches, massive cicadas that looked more like toys than living things, and those nasty giant horseflies whose bites felt like bee stings and left welts that lasted for days. But nothing, absolutely nothing had prepared me for this creature. Its body was a very dark green, almost black in the shadows, with a slight metallic sheen that caught the filtered sunlight as it moved. The exoskeleton looked segmented and incredibly hard, like pieces of armor that had been fitted together by some insane craftsman. Hooked legs dangled beneath it, twitching and grasping at the air as if searching for something to grab onto. The wings were translucent and veined, beating so fast they created a visible blur around the creature's body. By all laws of physics and biology that I understood, something that large and heavily built shouldn't have been able to achieve flight, let alone maintain the aerial agility it was demonstrating. Yet there it was, circling me at about 10 feet up, completely defying my understanding of what insects could or should be able to do. I wasn't scared at first. Not truly scared. Not in that primal way that makes you want to run until your lungs give out. I was shocked, certainly, amazed and confused, and more than a little unnerved. But I'd dealt with wildlife before. I'd had encounters with black bears that had gotten too curious about my food cache, coral snakes that I'd nearly stepped on, and even a Florida panther once that had stalked me for nearly a mile before losing interest. Weird as this beetle was, oversized and strange, it was still just a bug. Nothing I couldn't handle with some insect spray, or if it came to it, the bottom of my boot. I adjusted my pack, squared my shoulders, and started walking again at a measured pace. I kept my movements smooth and deliberate, not wanting to trigger any predatory response by running. Part of me expected the beetle to lose interest and buzz off into the trees like any normal insect would, but it didn't. Instead, the sound shifted dramatically, dropping to a lower register that I felt in my bones. When I glanced up again, my stomach dropped. The beetle was descending, coming down fast in a controlled dive that spoke of intention and purpose. It stopped abruptly about a foot from my face, its wings still hammering the air with such force that I could feel the wind against my skin. Then it just hovered there, perfectly still except for those blur of wings, and its eyes locked onto mine. Those eyes. God help me, those eyes. They were enormous, taking up nearly half of the creature's head, each one roughly the size of a golf ball. But it wasn't their size that made my heart stutter and my breath catch in my throat. They were huge black glossy orbs, but they weren't like any insect eyes I'd ever seen before. Most bugs have compound eyes, thousands of tiny lenses creating a fractured view of the world. These were different. They were smooth, deep, and wet-looking, like pools of crude oil or liquid obsidian. The surface seemed to move, swirling with depths that shouldn't have been possible in something organic. And they watched me. Not just reflexively detecting motion the way a spider or fly might register movement. Not just instinctually responding to a potential threat or food source. There was something intelligent behind those alien orbs. Something that knew I was there, that understood I was a thinking, feeling being, and that was examining me with what I could only describe as interest or perhaps evaluation. My skin erupted in goosebumps despite the suffocating heat. Cold fear washed through my veins, replacing the earlier warmth of exertion with icy dread. I couldn't move. My legs had locked in place, every muscle rigid with terror. I couldn't even blink, couldn't look away from those bottomless black eyes that seemed to pull at me, drawing my consciousness toward them like gravity. Time became meaningless. It felt like I stood there for hours, pinned by that inhuman gaze, but it was probably only seconds. My rational mind screamed at me to move, to run, to do something, but my body refused to obey. All I could do was stare back at the creature, feeling incredibly small and vulnerable and utterly out of my depth. Then, with a sharp flick of its wings, the beetle simply darted away. It moved with startling speed, shooting sideways and vanishing into the dense foliage, as if it had never been there at all. I stood there long after the beetle disappeared, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought they might crack. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes, and my hands were shaking so badly that when I tried to pick up my dropped hiking poles, I fumbled them twice before getting a secure grip. I wiped my face with my sleeve, trying to physically brush away the memory of those eyes, but the image was burned into my mind like a brand. I told myself it was nothing to worry about, just a strange encounter with unusual wildlife. The Everglades were full of creatures that had adapted to survive in this harsh environment, things that looked alien and acted in ways that seemed almost supernatural. This was just another one of them, probably some rare species that scientists hadn't properly documented yet. There was nothing to fear from a beetle, no matter how large or strange it appeared. But even as I tried to rationalize the encounter, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hike didn't feel relaxing anymore. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide something with glossy black eyes. I caught myself constantly checking the sky, scanning the gaps in the canopy, listening for that distinctive buzz. The peaceful solitude I'd been seeking had transformed into oppressive isolation. There was no one to call for help, no one who would hear me scream if something went wrong. By late afternoon, my legs were burning with fatigue and my water had run completely dry. I needed to stop, to rest and regroup. I found a relatively clear spot near a cypress tree, with good overhead cover, and began setting up my hammock with mechanical precision, trying to focus on the familiar task to calm my nerves. I pulled some dried fruit and jerky from my pack, laying them out on a bandana, but when I tried to eat, the food turned to sawdust in my mouth. I should have been ravenous after hours of hiking in brutal heat, but I had no appetite whatsoever. My stomach was twisted in knots, and every bite felt like swallowing stones. My mind kept replaying the encounter obsessively, examining every detail. The way the beetle had moved, purposeful and deliberate. The impossible size of it. Those eyes, God. Those eyes. Smooth and wet, and aware in a way that insects shouldn't be. I tried to remember if I'd read anything about beetles that could grow to such enormous sizes. If there was some environmental factor in the Everglades that could produce such mutations. But nothing in my admittedly limited knowledge of entomology explained what I'd seen. I crawled into my hammock early, before the sun had fully set, hoping that sleep might reset my overwrought nerves and help me see things more clearly in the morning. But rest didn't come easily. The normal sounds of the Everglades at twilight, the frogs beginning their evening chorus, the calls of night birds, the splash of something moving through water, all seemed amplified and threatening. Every noise made me tense, my eyes snapping open to scan the darkening spaces between the trees. When sleep finally claimed me, the dreams came fast and vicious. I was back on the trail, but everything was wrong. The sky was the color of a bruise, purple and black and sickly yellow. The trees had become twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching for me like clawed hands. And everywhere surrounding me, pressing in from all sides, was the buzzing. It was overwhelming, drowning out even my own thoughts. A wall of sound that seemed to come from above me, behind me, inside my head. I spun in circles in the dream, searching for the source, but I couldn't see the beetle anywhere. I knew it was there though, felt its presence like a physical weight on my chest, crushing the air from my lungs. Then its eyes appeared, floating in the darkness like twin moons, even bigger than before. They were unblinking, infinite, pulling me toward them with irresistible force. I tried to scream, to turn away, but I was frozen, falling forward into those bottomless pools of black. As I started to drown in them, to feel my identity dissolving into the darkness, my hands flew to my throat. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't. I woke up gasping and thrashing, almost pitching myself out of the hammock onto the ground below. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might be having a cardiac event. For several terrifying seconds, I couldn't remember where I was, could only feel the phantom sensation of drowning, of being pulled into something vast and hungry. Then reality reasserted itself slowly. I was in the Everglades. I was in my hammock. I was safe. Except I didn't feel safe at all. The darkness around me buzzed with the night songs of countless creatures, and I lay there rigid with fear, listening intently, trying to separate out individual sounds from the cacophony. Every noise sounded like wings to my paranoid ears. Every shift in the breeze felt like something large moving through the air nearby. I stared up at the canopy above me, at the patches of star-studded sky visible through the leaves, half expecting to see that massive silhouette appear at any moment. Sleep was impossible after that. I lay in my hammock watching the sky slowly lighten from black to deep blue to the pale gray of dawn. The moment there was enough light to see by, I practically tore my campsite apart in my haste to pack up. My original plan had been to stay another day, to loop back through a different trail system and really immerse myself in the wilderness experience. But I couldn't do it. I needed out. I needed concrete and crowds and the reassuring normalcy of civilization. The hike back to the parking lot was 6 miles of pure torture. I set a brutal pace, pushing myself harder than I'd pushed in years, barely stopping even to drink what little water I'd been able to purify from a stream. My legs were burning. My pack was digging into my shoulders, creating raw spots that would probably blister, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't slow down. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get out of this place as fast as humanly possible. I kept my head on a swivel the entire way, jerking at every sound, my neck muscles aching from the constant tension. My ears strained to detect any hint of that buzzing sound over my own labored breathing, and the crunch of my boots on the trail. Birds took flight from trees ahead of me, and each time my heart would stop, certain that it was the beetle, that it had found me again, that those eyes would pin me in place. The parking lot came into view around noon, and I nearly sobbed with relief. My beaten-up sedan sat alone in the gravel lot, exactly where I'd left it, looking like the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I didn't even slow down, just threw my gear into the trunk with no care for organization, slammed it shut, and locked all the doors before I'd even caught my breath properly. The drive home was absolutely insane. 2 hours of winding 2-lane roads, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, gripping so hard my fingers went numb. I kept checking the rearview mirror compulsively, expecting to see that beetle flying behind the car, those black eyes reflecting in my mirrors, watching me through the rear window. I knew how irrational that was. Insects didn't chase cars, didn't follow specific humans for miles, but I couldn't stop myself from looking, couldn't shake the paranoid certainty that I was still being observed. When I finally pulled into my apartment complex, I sat in the car for a solid 10 minutes, just breathing, trying to convince myself I was truly safe now. The normalcy of the parking lot, the other cars, the sound of a television from someone's window, the smell of someone grilling dinner, felt like waking up from a nightmare. I dumped my pack in the garage without even unpacking it properly, and went straight to the shower, letting the hot water blast away the sweat and dirt, and hopefully some of the terror. I stood under the spray until the water ran cold, scrubbing my skin until it was red and raw. I told myself repeatedly that I was overreacting, that I was experiencing some kind of late-onset entomophobia. That's the clinical term for an irrational fear of insects, and God knows I had that now. And yes, the beetle had seemed huge, football-sized even, but perspective could be tricky in stressful situations. It was probably much smaller in reality, just a normal beetle that had seemed larger because of fear and adrenaline, and the disorientation of the deep wilderness. But that night, lying in my own bed with the door locked and the windows closed, despite the heat, I kept seeing those eyes, black and bottomless, knowing, intelligent in a way that made my skin crawl. They were waiting there behind my eyelids every time I tried to close them, waiting to pull me down into their depths. I got up eventually and grabbed my laptop, spending hours searching online. I looked up big beetles, wilderness insects, rare species of Coleoptera, anything that might match what I'd seen. The closest matches were some oversized species from South America, Hercules beetles, and Titan beetles that could reach impressive sizes, but none of them quite fit. None of them had eyes like that. None of them had that same presence, that sense of awareness that had frozen me in place on the trail. Days passed, then weeks, and I didn't say a word to anyone about the encounter. Not my buddies who hiked regularly, and would have understood the appeal of solo wilderness trips. Not my nerdy younger brother, who might actually have been interested in helping me research unusual insects. I was scared they'd think I was crazy, that they'd laugh, or worse, look at me with that pitying expression people get when they think someone is losing it. How could I explain what those eyes had made me feel? How could I convey the bone-deep certainty that I'd seen something that shouldn't exist? The hiking gear still sits in my garage, gathering dust and spider webs. I haven't been back to the Everglades or any other wilderness area. I've tried to convince myself to go, have even driven to trailheads a few times, but I can't make myself get out of the car. The fear is too strong, too visceral. What if it's out there waiting? What if it remembers me the way I remember it? I stick to the city now, finding comfort in concrete and crowds. The only bugs I encounter are cockroaches and the occasional housefly. The only buzzing I hear is traffic and construction and all the mechanical sounds of human civilization. My friends don't understand why I've stopped hiking, why I've given up something I used to talk about constantly. I make excuses about being busy with work, about wanting to try new hobbies, about anything except the truth. And I never thought I'd ever say this in a million years. But now I actually feel safer here, surrounded by steel and glass and artificial lights. The wilderness no longer calls to me with promises of peace and solitude. Now it only whispers of black eyes in the shadows, watching, waiting, remembering. Sometimes I still dream about those eyes, and I wake up with my hands at my throat, gasping for air, drowning in darkness that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares. I tell myself that one day I'll go back, that I'll reclaim that part of my life that the beetle took from me. But deep down, I know the truth. Whatever I saw out there in the Everglades, whatever intelligence looked at me through those impossible eyes, it changed something fundamental in me. The wilderness isn't mine anymore. It belongs to things I can't understand, things that remind me how small and fragile we really are. And maybe that's the real horror. Not the beetle itself, but the knowledge it left me with. The certainty that we're not alone in the wild places, that something ancient and alien and utterly indifferent to our existence watches from the shadows, something that flies on impossible wings and sees with eyes that look into your soul. I'm safe now. I tell myself every night, safe in my locked apartment, safe in my city of millions. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear it. That deep, resonant buzzing, just at the edge of hearing. And I have to check the windows, have to peer into the darkness outside, searching for glossy black orbs reflecting the street lights. They're never there, but someday, I fear they might be. My name is Ronald Hall, and I am 81 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me in 2017, right here in Pine Ridge, Alabama. I've been a cop in this town for about 10 years now. You know the type, small town cop, knows everyone, everyone knows me. Married with 2 kids, a mortgage that feels like it's hanging over my head every month, and a car that's always in need of repairs. I guess you could say I'm living the dream. Pine Ridge is one of those places that time seems to have forgotten. We're not on any major highways, and the closest city is a good 2-hour drive away. The town's main street looks like it could be a set from a 1950s movie, complete with a soda fountain at the local drugstore. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, and gossip spreads faster than wildfire. I've seen my fair share of trouble in my years on the force, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that summer. It all started on a Friday evening in late June. The air was thick with humidity, and the cicadas were singing their endless summer song. My partner Tony Hargrove and I were wrapping up what had been a quiet shift. Tony's a funny guy, always has a joke ready, and that day was no different. He was rambling on about his latest DIY disaster involving a squirrel, a ladder, and a broken gutter. I laughed so hard I almost spilled my coffee. "Man, I swear," Tony said, shaking his head as we cruised down Main Street. "Next time I'm hiring someone." That squirrel looked at me like I was the idiot. I chuckled, wiping tears of laughter from my eyes. "Maybe you should stick to police work, Tony. Leave the home repairs to the professionals." We were heading towards the outskirts of town, where the neatly kept lawns give way to dense woods. Pine Ridge sits right at the edge of a vast forest, and sometimes it feels like the trees are trying to reclaim the town, inch by inch. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods seemed darker than usual, the shadows deeper. "You ever get the feeling that something's watching you from those trees?" I asked Tony, only half joking. He glanced at me, his usual grin fading slightly. Don't tell me you're getting spooked in your old age, Ron. It's just trees. I was about to retort when the radio crackled to life. All units, we have a report of a missing person. Teenager, female. Last seen leaving Pine Ridge High School. Tony and I exchanged glances. Missing persons weren't common in Pine Ridge. Sure, we'd had our share of kids staying out past curfew, or running away for a day or two. But a genuine disappearance? That was rare. Dispatch, this is Unit 17, I responded. We're on our way. Can you give us more details? The dispatcher's voice came back, tight with tension. Missing girl is Amelia Sutton, age 17. Last seen leaving debate club practice at approximately 5:30 p.m. Mother reported her missing when she didn't return home by 7 p.m. I felt a chill run down my spine. Amelia Sutton was a name I knew well. She was the daughter of the town's mayor, a bright kid with a promising future. Straight-A student, head of the debate team, volunteered at the local animal shelter, not the type to just disappear. We're on it, I told the dispatcher, flipping on our siren as Tony accelerated. As we sped towards the Sutton residence, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be more than just a routine missing persons case. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road, and I found myself watching the tree line, half expecting to see something emerge from the darkness. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would shake Pine Ridge to its very core. We arrived at the Sutton house just as full darkness was settling over Pine Ridge. It was one of those big old southern homes, all white columns and wraparound porches. Usually it looked warm and inviting, but tonight, with all the lights blazing and police cars in the driveway, it had an almost ominous air. Mayor Richard Sutton met us at the door, his normally confident demeanor replaced by barely contained panic. "Run, Tony," he said, his voice strained. "Thank God you're here. Please, you have to find her." We followed him into the living room, where his wife Margaret sat on the couch, clutching a tissue and staring blankly at a school photo of Amelia. She looked up as we entered, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "She never does this," Margaret kept saying, her voice barely above a whisper. "Amelia always calls if she's going to be late. Always." Tony took the lead, asking all the standard questions. "Last seen, friends she might be with. Anything unusual in her behavior lately?" The Suttons answered as best they could, but it was clear they were in shock. "May I take a look around?" I asked. Richard nodded, gesturing vaguely towards the stairs. I made my way up to Amelia's room, my eyes scanning for anything out of place. It was a tidy space, walls covered with debate trophies and honor roll certificates. A stack of college brochures sat on the desk, next to a laptop. Something caught my eye. A framed photo on the nightstand. It showed Amelia with a group of friends, all smiling at the camera, but there was something off about the picture. In the background, barely visible, was a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was blurry, but I could make out unnaturally long limbs, and what looked like glowing eyes. I picked up the frame, a chill running down my spine. Was this some kind of prank? A trick of the light? Or something more sinister? Back downstairs, I pulled Tony aside. "We need to check the school," I said quietly. "Something's not right here." We left a couple of officers with the Suttons and headed to Pine Ridge High. The school was dark and silent, looking more like a mausoleum than a place of learning. We talked to the night janitor, who let us in. The halls echoed with our footsteps as we made our way to the debate club room. Everything seemed normal. Chairs stacked neatly, whiteboard erased clean. But then I noticed something under one of the desks. It was a charm bracelet, one I recognized from the photo in Amelia's room. And next to it, barely visible on the linoleum floor, was a single, long black hair, much too long to be human. "Tony," I called, my voice sounding strange in the empty room. "Take a look at this." He crouched down next to me, his flashlight illuminating the strange hair. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. Before I could answer, we heard a sound from the hallway. A soft shuffling noise, like something large dragging itself across the floor. We both froze, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. Tony and I drew our weapons, moving silently towards the door. The hallway was dark, our flashlight beams cutting through the gloom. The shuffling had stopped, but I could feel a presence, something watching us from the shadows. Suddenly, a figure darted across the far end of the hallway, tall, impossibly thin, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Our flashlights caught it for just a second, illuminating pale, almost translucent skin, and eyes that glowed an eerie yellow in the beam. "Police! Stop!" Tony shouted, but the figure was already gone, disappearing around a corner. We gave chase, our hearts pounding. But when we rounded the corner, the hallway was empty. No doors, no windows, nowhere for anyone, or anything to hide. "What the hell was that?" Tony gasped, his usual joking manner completely gone. I shook my head, trying to process what I'd seen. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think we just got our first clue about what happened to Amelia." As we left the school, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The woods seemed to press in around us, the trees whispering secrets in the night breeze. Whatever had taken Amelia, it wasn't human, and I had a sinking feeling that we were in way over our heads. Little did I know this was just the beginning of a terror that would grip Pine Ridge, testing not just our skills as police officers, but our very understanding of reality itself. The next few days were a blur of activity. We set up a command center at the station, coordinating search parties, and following up on every lead, no matter how small. The whole town was on edge, and volunteers poured in to help with the search. But as the days stretched on with no sign of Amelia, hope began to fade. The woods around Pine Ridge seemed to swallow up every clue, every trail. It was like she had vanished into thin air. I couldn't shake the memory of what we'd seen at the school. That thing, whatever it was, haunted my dreams. I found myself poring over old case files, looking for anything similar, any hint of what we might be dealing with. It was on the 4th day of the search that we got our first real break. A local hunter, Jim Cook, came into the station looking pale and shaken. "I saw something out there," he said, his voice trembling. "In the old Barkley Caves. Something not right." The Barkley Caves were an old limestone formation deep in the woods, about 5 miles from town. They'd been a popular spot for teenagers to explore until a few years back when one of the caves collapsed. The area had been declared off limits, but that didn't always stop thrill seekers. "What did you see, Jim?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He shook his head, as if trying to clear a bad memory. "I was tracking a deer," he said, "led me near the caves. That's when I heard it. This sound, like singing, but not like any voice I've ever heard. It was beautiful, but wrong somehow. I felt a chill run down my spine. Did you see anything?" Jim nodded slowly. "Just for a second. There was something moving in the cave entrance. Tall, thin. I thought it was a person at first, but the way it moved. No person moves like that. And its eyes." He trailed off, shuddering. I exchanged a glance with Tony. This matched what we'd seen at the school. "Did you see anyone else?" I asked. "Any sign of Amelia?" Jim shook his head. "No, but..." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a torn piece of fabric. "I found this caught on a branch near the caves." My heart jumped into my throat. The fabric was from a Pine Ridge High School debate team jacket. Within the hour, we had a team assembled and were heading into the woods. The Barkley Caves were deep in the forest, far from any trails. As we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The woods seemed unnaturally quiet, no birds singing, no small animals scurrying through the underbrush. We reached the caves just as the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The entrance loomed before us, a dark maw in the limestone cliff face. The air around it felt colder, and there was a faint, sweet smell that I couldn't quite place. "All right, listen up," I said to the team. "We go in pairs. No one goes off alone. Keep your radios on at all times. If you see anything, and I mean anything unusual, you call it in immediately. Got it?" Everyone nodded, their faces grim. We'd all heard Jim's story, and there was a tension in the air, a sense that we were about to face something beyond our normal experience. Tony and I took the lead, our flashlights cutting through the darkness of the cave. The sweet smell grew stronger as we moved deeper, mixed now with the musty scent of damp stone and something else, something rotten. We'd been searching for about an hour when one of the other teams radioed in. "We've found something," Officer Johnson's voice crackled over the radio. "You need to see this." We made our way to their location, deep in the cave system. As we rounded a corner, I saw Johnson and his partner standing in front of a small alcove, their flashlights illuminating something on the cave wall. My breath caught in my throat. The wall was covered in drawings, crude but unmistakable. They showed tall, thin figures with glowing eyes, surrounded by smaller figures that could only be humans. And in the center of it all was a larger drawing, a creature that looked like a cross between a man and a spider, with too many limbs and a head that was all teeth and eyes. "What the hell is this?" Tony whispered, his voice echoing in the cave. Before anyone could answer, we heard it. A sound drifting through the caves, ethereal and haunting. It was like Jim had described, singing, but like no human voice I'd ever heard. It was beautiful and terrible all at once, and I felt an overwhelming urge to follow it, to find its source. "Ron," Tony said, shaking my arm. "Ron, snap out of it." I blinked, realizing I'd taken several steps towards the sound without even being aware of it. The others looked equally dazed. "We need to get out of here," I said, fighting against the pull of that otherworldly music. Now, as we retreated from the cave, the singing grew louder, more insistent. I could have sworn I heard words in it now, promises of beauty and knowledge beyond human understanding. It took every ounce of willpower I had not to turn back. We burst out of the cave into the cool night air, gasping and disoriented. As I turned to do a head count, my blood ran cold. We were one person short. "Where's Johnson?" I asked, my voice tight with fear. A scream echoed from the cave, abruptly cut short. Then silence, broken only by the normal sounds of the forest at night. We searched for hours, but there was no sign of Johnson. It was as if the cave had swallowed him whole. As we made our way back to town, defeated and shaken, I knew we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. Whatever had taken Amelia, whatever was lurking in those caves, it wasn't human, and it was hungry for more. The hunt for Amelia had become something else entirely. Now it was a fight for the very soul of Pine Ridge, and I had a sinking feeling that we were losing. The disappearance of Officer Johnson sent shockwaves through Pine Ridge. The town, already on edge from Amelia's vanishing, now teetered on the brink of panic. Rumors spread like wildfire. Tales of monsters in the woods, of an ancient evil awakening, of a curse upon the town. I tried to keep a lid on things, to present a calm face to the public, but inside I was as scared as anyone. The things we'd seen in that cave, the drawings on the wall, that unearthly singing, it all pointed to something far beyond our normal experience. In the days that followed, more people came forward with stories. A group of hikers who heard strange whispers in the woods. A farmer who saw tall shadow-like figures moving through his fields at night. A child who drew pictures of a tall man with too many arms who visited her in her dreams. Each story added to the growing sense of dread that hung over Pine Ridge like a shroud. People began to lock their doors at night, to eye the woods with suspicion. Parents kept their children close, and no one ventured out after dark if they could help it. I spent long hours at the station, poring over old records, looking for any hint of similar occurrences in the town's history, and slowly a pattern began to emerge. Every 27 years, almost to the day, there was a spike in missing persons cases in Pine Ridge. Most were written off as runaways or tragic accidents, but the similarities were striking, and each time there were reports of strange sightings, of eerie sounds in the woods. And each time there were reports of strange sightings, of eerie sounds in the woods, of an unnatural stillness descending over the town. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever we were dealing with, it had been here before. It had been taking people for generations, and somehow we'd all forgotten. Or maybe we'd chosen to forget, to push the horrors into the dark corners of our minds where they couldn't hurt us. I shared my findings with Tony, watching his face pale as he connected the dots. "Jesus, Ron," he whispered, running a hand through his hair. "What the hell are we up against?" I shook my head, feeling the weight of our situation pressing down on me. "I don't know, Tony, but whatever it is, it's been here a long time, and I think it's getting stronger." As if to confirm my fears, reports of missing persons began to trickle in. A night watchman at the lumber yard, a teenager out for a late-night drive, an elderly woman who lived on the edge of town. Each disappearance was accompanied by reports of strange noises, of shadows moving where no shadows should be, of that haunting, otherworldly singing. The town was reaching a breaking point. People were talking about leaving, about abandoning Pine Ridge to whatever malevolent force had taken root here. I couldn't blame them, but the thought of this thing spreading, of it moving on to other towns, other victims, was unbearable. It was Tony who suggested we bring in outside help. "We're out of our depth here, Ron," he said one night, as we sat in the station, surrounded by case files and cups of cold coffee. "We need someone who knows about this kind of thing." I nodded slowly, an idea forming. "I might know someone," I said. "An old friend from my days at the academy. He left the force to become a private investigator, specializing in unusual cases." Tony raised an eyebrow. "Unusual how?" I managed a grim smile. "Let's just say he's seen things that would make our current situation look like a walk in the park." The next day, I made the call. Frank Morrison had been one of the best detectives I'd ever known, with an uncanny ability to see connections others missed. When he left the force to pursue what many considered fringe cases, a lot of people thought he'd lost it. But I'd kept in touch over the years, and some of the stories he'd shared with me, well, they made our current situation seem almost plausible. Frank arrived in Pine Ridge 2 days later, a tall, lean figure with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much. He listened silently as Tony and I filled him in on everything that had happened, his expression grave. "I've seen something like this before," he said when we'd finished. "Not exactly the same, but similar enough. It's not going to be easy, and I can't promise we'll save everyone, but I think I know how to stop it." A glimmer of hope sparked in my chest. "What do we need to do?" Frank's eyes met mine, and I saw a mix of determination and fear in them. "We need to go back to those caves, and we need to face this thing on its own turf." As Frank laid out his plan, I felt a chill run down my spine. What he was proposing was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but as I looked at the map of Pine Ridge on my desk, at the markers showing each disappearance, I knew we had no choice. Whatever was lurking in the shadows of Pine Ridge, whatever had been feeding on our town for generations, it was time to bring it into the light, even if it cost us everything. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Frank's plan was risky, to say the least. We were going to enter the Barkley Caves again, but this time armed with more than just flashlights and good intentions. Frank had brought with him an arsenal of specialized equipment: electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and other devices I couldn't even begin to understand. "This entity, whatever it is, exists partially outside our normal reality," Frank explained as we went over the plan one last time. "These tools will help us detect its presence and hopefully find its weaknesses." We decided to keep the operation small, just Frank, Tony, and myself. The fewer people we put at risk, the better. Plus, as Frank pointed out, a larger group would be more likely to attract the creature's attention before we were ready. The night before we were set to enter the caves, I found myself standing on my back porch, staring out at the woods that bordered my property. The trees seemed to loom larger than usual, their shadows deeper and more menacing. For a moment I thought I saw movement at the tree line, a tall, thin figure with 2 long limbs, but when I blinked, it was gone. Sleep was elusive that night, my dreams filled with echoes of that otherworldly singing and glimpses of glowing eyes in the darkness. I woke before dawn, feeling as if I hadn't slept at all. We met at the station as the sun was rising, loading our gear into my patrol car. The town was quiet, most people still asleep, unaware of the battle we were about to wage on their behalf. The drive to the Barkley Caves was tense, each of us lost in our own thoughts. As we hiked through the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that unseen eyes were following our every move. The cave entrance loomed before us, a dark maw in the limestone cliff face. The air around it was noticeably colder, and that sickly sweet smell I remembered from our previous visit was stronger now. Frank paused at the entrance, pulling out a small device that looked like a cross between a cell phone and a Geiger counter. It emitted a soft, pulsing tone that grew more rapid as he pointed it towards the cave. "It's here," he said quietly, "and it's strong. Be ready for anything." We entered the cave, our headlamps cutting through the darkness. The sweet smell grew stronger as we moved deeper, mixed now with something else, a scent of decay and rot that made my stomach churn. We'd been moving through the tunnels for what felt like hours, guided by Frank's instruments, when we heard it. That haunting, beautiful singing that had nearly enthralled us on our last visit. "Cover your ears," Frank hissed, pulling out what looked like high-tech earplugs. "These will filter out the frequencies it uses to mesmerize its victims." With the earplugs in, the singing became a distant, discordant noise, no longer compelling but still unsettling. We pressed on, the passages growing narrower and more twisted. Suddenly, Frank's device began to emit a high-pitched whine. "We're close," he said, his voice tight with tension. "Get ready." We rounded a corner and found ourselves in a large cavern. The walls were covered in those strange primitive drawings we'd seen before, but they seemed to move in the light of our headlamps, telling a story of hunger and terror that spanned centuries. And there, in the center of the cavern, was the creature. It was hard to look at directly, my eyes struggling to make sense of its form. It was tall, at least 9 feet, with a body that seemed to shift and change as it moved. Multiple limbs too thin and long to be human, ended in sharp claw-like appendages. Its head was a nightmare of eyes and teeth, constantly rearranging themselves. But what struck me most were its eyes, not the multitude of smaller ones that blinked and shifted across its form, but the 2 large primary eyes that fixed on us as we entered. They glowed with an inner light, filled with an intelligence and malevolence that froze me to my core. My, it said, its voice a chorus of whispers and screams. "What brave little morsels have wandered into my den?" Frank stepped forward, raising a device that emitted a piercing shriek. The creature recoiled, its form rippling in pain or anger. "We know what you are," Frank said, his voice steady despite the terror I knew he must be feeling. "And we're here to stop you." The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass and crying children. "Stop me? Oh, you amusing little specks. I am eternal. I am hunger itself. And you are nothing but food." It lunged forward with impossible speed, its limbs elongating to reach for us. Tony and I opened fire, our bullets seeming to pass through it without effect. Frank shouted something I couldn't make out over the gunfire, activating another of his devices. A pulse of energy filled the cavern, and the creature screamed, a sound of rage and pain that shook the very stone around us. It retreated, its form becoming less substantial, almost smoke-like. "The gate," Frank yelled. "We need to close the gate." I saw it then, a shimmer in the air behind the creature, like heat haze, but darker, more malevolent. Frank was already moving towards it, pulling out what looked like a small metal box covered in strange symbols. The creature, realizing our intent, surged forward again. "I will devour your souls," it shrieked. "I will feast on your fear for eternity." Tony and I tried to hold it back, firing round after round into its shifting form. Frank reached the gate, his hands moving in complex patterns as he chanted words in a language I didn't recognize. The air in the cavern grew thick, charged with an energy that made my hair stand on end. The creature howled, its form stretching and distorting as it tried to reach Frank. And then, with a sound like reality itself tearing, the gate collapsed. The creature gave one final terrible scream as it was pulled back, its form dissolving into wisps of shadow that were sucked into the closing tier. In the sudden silence that followed, I became aware of a new sound, soft human weeping. In the far corner of the cavern, huddled together, were the missing people of Pine Ridge. Amelia, Officer Johnson, and the others, all alive but clearly traumatized by their ordeal. As we helped them to their feet, guiding them towards the cave entrance and the sunlight beyond, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. We had faced the darkness, had stared into the abyss, and we had emerged victorious. But as I glanced back at the cavern, one last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that this victory was temporary. The creature was gone, yes, but for how long? And what other horrors might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to prey on the unsuspecting? As we stepped out of the cave into the warm summer sun, I knew that Pine Ridge, and perhaps the world, would never look quite the same to me again. The shadows would always be a little deeper, the night a little darker, and the unknown a little more terrifying. But we had survived. We had fought back against the darkness, and for now at least, that had to be enough. The days and weeks that followed our confrontation in the caves were a blur of debriefings, medical examinations, and attempts to return to some semblance of normalcy. The official story, carefully crafted by Frank and corroborated by Tony and myself, was that a disturbed individual had been responsible for the kidnappings, using the cave system as a hideout. It was a flimsy explanation that left many questions unanswered, but it was better than the truth. The survivors were all physically unharmed, but the psychological trauma they had endured was evident. Amelia Sutton, once vivacious and outgoing, had become withdrawn and quiet. Officer Johnson resigned from the force, unable to reconcile what he had experienced with his view of the world. Others reported nightmares, anxiety, and a persistent feeling of being watched. Frank stayed in Pine Ridge for a few weeks, helping us tie up loose ends and ensuring that the gate remained closed. Before he left, he took me aside for a conversation I'll never forget. "Ron," he said, his eyes grave, "what you've seen, what you've been through, it changes a person. The world isn't what most people think it is. There are dark corners, hidden places where nightmares become real. You've glimpsed that world now, and you can't unsee it." I nodded, understanding all too well what he meant. "So what do we do?" I asked. "Just go back to normal life, pretending none of this happened?" Frank gave a sad smile. "Normal is a luxury you might not have anymore, but you can be prepared. Vigilant. There are others out there, people who know about these things, who fight against the darkness. If you ever need help, or if you see signs of something like this happening again, call me." He handed me a card with a phone number. Not his regular business card, but something different, with strange symbols etched around the edges. As Frank drove away, I stood on the steps of the police station, feeling the weight of new knowledge and responsibility settling on my shoulders. Pine Ridge looked the same as it always had, the quaint main street, the old-fashioned storefronts, the dense woods surrounding the town. But now I knew what could lurk in those woods, what ancient hungers might be awakening in the dark places of the world. Tony came up beside me, his usual jovial demeanor subdued. "So," he said, "back to business as usual?" I looked at him, saw the same knowledge, the same burden in his eyes that I felt in my own. "I don't think there's any such thing as usual for us anymore, partner," I replied. He nodded, understanding. "We'll face it together, whatever comes next." And so life in Pine Ridge went on. On the surface, things returned to normal. The townspeople, resilient as ever, began to put the terrifying events behind them. But there was an undercurrent of wariness now, a shared secret that hung in the air like a mist. I found myself unable to relax, always watching, always alert for signs that the darkness might be creeping back in. Every unexplained noise, every shadow that seemed a little too deep, set my nerves on edge. I kept Frank's card with me at all times, a talisman against the unknown horrors that I now knew existed. Months passed, and then years. Pine Ridge remained quiet, but I never forgot what we had faced in those caves. The memory of that creature, of its hunger and its terrible beauty, haunted my dreams. I knew that somewhere out there, in the spaces between what we think of as reality, it was waiting for another chance, another opening, another feast. And I knew that when that time came, I would be ready. For the sake of Pine Ridge, for the sake of all the innocent people who had no idea of the terrors that lurked in the shadows, I would stand against the darkness again. Because that's what being a cop, a protector, really means. Not just upholding the law, but defending the light against the encroaching shadows, no matter the cost. As I sit here now, an old man looking back on a life filled with both ordinary and extraordinary moments, I can't help but wonder, how many other small towns have their own dark secrets? How many other people have stared into the abyss and lived to tell the tale? And most importantly, who will stand guard when I'm gone? The woods outside my window seem to whisper with secrets, and sometimes on quiet nights I think I hear a faint haunting melody drifting on the breeze. A reminder that the battle is never truly over, that vigilance is the price we pay for the safety of those we protect. So I keep watch, my old eyes scanning the shadows, my hand never far from Frank's card, and the promise of help it represents. Because in Pine Ridge, Alabama, the night is dark and full of terrors, and someone has to keep them at bay. 5 years after our encounter in the Barkley Caves, I found myself standing in front of a classroom at Pine Ridge High School. The familiar faces of teenagers looked back at me, a mix of boredom and curiosity in their eyes. I had been invited to speak about my experiences in law enforcement, part of the school's Career Day program. As I spoke about the more mundane aspects of police work, my eyes were drawn to a girl sitting in the back row. She looked eerily like Amelia Sutton, and for a moment I felt a chill run down my spine. But no, this was Amelia's younger sister, born a year after the incident. She had never known her sister as she was before, only the quiet, haunted young woman she had become. After the presentation, as the students filed out, the girl, Laura, I remembered, approached me. "Officer Hall," she said, her voice hesitant, "can I ask you something? About what happened to my sister?" I felt a knot form in my stomach. How much did she know? How much could I tell her without revealing the terrifying truth? "Of course, Laura," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What would you like to know?" She bit her lip, clearly struggling with her words. I've heard things, whispers, about what really happened that summer. About creatures in the woods. Is it true?" I felt my heart rate quicken. How much did she know? How much had been passed down in hushed conversations and half-remembered nightmares? "Laura," I said carefully, "a lot of stories get exaggerated over time. What happened to your sister was terrible, but—" "Please," she interrupted, her eyes pleading. "I need to know. I've been having these dreams about something in the caves, something hungry." A chill ran down my spine. Could it be possible? After all these years, could the creature be trying to come back? "What kind of dreams, Laura?" I asked, my voice low. She glanced around, making sure we were alone. "I see it sometimes, in the woods behind our house. Tall and thin, with too many arms. And its eyes," she shuddered, "they glow in the dark." I felt a wave of dread wash over me. This was too specific, too close to what we had faced, to be mere coincidence. "Have you told anyone else about these dreams?" I asked urgently. She shook her head. "Just you. I thought maybe you'd understand. Because of what happened to Amelia." I nodded slowly, my mind racing. "Laura, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Those dreams, they might be more than just dreams. I want you to call me immediately if you see anything unusual, day or night. Anything at all. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes wide. I scribbled my number on a piece of paper and handed it to her. "And Laura," I added, "be careful in the woods. Don't go there alone, especially at night." As she walked away, I pulled out my phone and the card Frank had given me years ago. The symbols around the edges seemed to shimmer in the fluorescent light of the school hallway. "Frank," I said when he answered, "we might have a problem in Pine Ridge. I think it's trying to come back." His voice was grim when he replied. "I was afraid of this. The cycle is starting again. I'm on my way, Ron. Don't do anything until I get there." As I hung up, I looked out the window at the woods that surrounded Pine Ridge. They seemed darker somehow, more ominous. The creature we had faced was stirring, reaching out through dreams and whispers. The battle we thought we had won was far from over. It was just beginning again. And this time, we had a new generation to protect. The days following my conversation with Laura were tense, filled with a growing sense of dread. Frank arrived in Pine Ridge within 48 hours, his face grim and his car loaded with equipment I didn't recognize. "It's worse than we thought," he told me, as we sat in my living room, going over the details. "The entity we faced, it's not just one creature. It's part of something larger, something that's been here far longer than we realized." He spread out a map on the coffee table, covered in markings and symbols I didn't understand. "These are ley lines," he explained, "channels of energy that crisscross the earth. Pine Ridge sits at a convergence point. It's a place of power, and that's what attracts these things." I felt a chill run down my spine. "So what do we do?" Frank's eyes met mine, and I saw a mixture of determination and fear in them. "We prepare. We watch. And when the time comes, we fight." Over the next few weeks, we set up a network of sensors and cameras throughout the town, focusing on the woods and the area around the Barkley Caves. Frank trained Tony and me in the use of various devices and weapons designed to combat supernatural entities. But even as we prepared, the signs of the creature's return grew more frequent. More people reported strange dreams and sightings of a tall, thin figure in the woods. Pets went missing. The air grew thick with that sickly sweet smell I remembered all too well. It all came to a head on a moonless night in late October. I was on patrol with Tony when the call came in. Laura Sutton had gone missing. We raced to the Sutton house, my heart pounding. Mayor Sutton met us at the door, his face pale with fear. "She went for a walk in the woods," he said, his voice shaking. "She does it all the time. But she should have been back hours ago." I exchanged a glance with Tony. We both knew where she had gone. "Call Frank," I told Tony as we headed for the woods. "Tell him to meet us at the caves." The forest was eerily silent as we made our way towards the Barkley Caves, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The sweet smell grew stronger as we approached, mixed now with the metallic scent of ozone. Frank was waiting for us at the cave entrance, his face grim. "It's opened a new gate," he said without preamble. "We need to move fast." We entered the cave system, the air growing colder and thicker with each step. The walls seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, the primitive drawings moving and shifting in the beam of our lights. As we descended deeper into the earth, we began to hear it, that haunting, beautiful singing that had nearly enthralled us years before. But this time, mixed with the ethereal melody, I could hear a human voice. "Laura." We burst into the main cavern, and the sight that greeted us was like something out of a nightmare. The creature stood in the center of the room, its form even more terrifying than I remembered. Multiple limbs writhed and twisted, its body constantly shifting and reforming. And there, suspended in a cocoon of shadow and light, was Laura. "Welcome back, little morsels," the creature said, its voice a chorus of whispers and screams. "Have you come to join our feast?" Frank stepped forward, raising a device that emitted a high-pitched whine. The creature recoiled, its form rippling in pain. "Let her go," I demanded, my voice steadier than I felt. The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass and dying stars. "Oh, but she came willingly. She heard our song, felt our hunger. She understands now, as you never could." Laura's eyes opened, and I saw with horror that they had turned completely black. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice distant and dreamy. "Can't you see? It wants to show us everything." "Laura, no," I shouted. "Don't listen to it." But even as I spoke, I could feel the pull of the creature's song, the promise of knowledge and power beyond human comprehension. It took every ounce of willpower I had to resist. Frank was chanting now, words in a language I didn't recognize. The air in the cavern grew thick with energy, sparks of otherworldly light dancing around us. The creature howled in rage and pain, its form becoming less substantial. "You cannot stop us," it shrieked. "We are eternal. We are hunger itself." But Frank's chant grew louder, and I could see the gate beginning to close. The creature's limbs stretched towards us, claws raking the air inches from our faces. In a final desperate move, I lunged forward, grabbing Laura and pulling her free from the cocoon of energy. She screamed, a sound of loss and longing that tore at my heart. And then, with a sound like reality itself tearing, the gate collapsed. The creature gave one last terrible scream as it was pulled back, its form dissolving into wisps of shadow that were sucked into the closing tier. In the sudden silence that followed, I became aware of Laura sobbing in my arms. Her eyes were back to normal, filled now with tears and terror. "It's over," I said softly, holding her close. "You're safe now." But even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. The creature was gone, yes, but for how long? And what other horrors might be waiting in the spaces between worlds, hungry for a taste of our reality? As we made our way out of the caves, Laura clinging to me and Tony supporting an exhausted Frank, I couldn't shake the feeling that this victory, like the last, was only temporary. The darkness had risen once again in Pine Ridge, and though we had pushed it back, I knew now that it would always be there, waiting, watching, hungry, but we would be ready. We would stand guard against the night, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Because that's what it means to be a protector, to be a cop in a town where the shadows hold secrets darker than anyone could imagine. As we stepped out of the cave into the pre-dawn light, I looked at Tony and Frank, saw the same determination in their eyes that I felt in my heart. Whatever came next, whatever horrors the future might hold, we would face it together. For Pine Ridge, for Laura and Amelia, for all those who walked in the light, unaware of the darkness that lurked just beyond. We would keep watch. We would stand guard. And when the darkness rose again, as I knew it would, we would be there to push it back once more. My name is Larry Lewis, and I am 73 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened on a sweltering July night in 2010, a night that changed my life forever. I've been driving trucks for over 4 decades, hauling everything from livestock to machinery across this great country of ours. But on this particular run, I was transporting a load of furniture from Texas to North Carolina. I've always loved the open road. There's something about the solitude, the endless stretch of asphalt ahead, and the simple satisfaction of getting from point A to point B that's always appealed to me. It's a job that requires focus, patience, and a certain comfort with being alone. But that night, I found myself wishing for company, for someone to witness the horror that was about to unfold. The sun had long since set as I cruised down Interstate 30, somewhere in the heart of Arkansas. The darkness was thick, broken only by the occasional flicker of my headlights catching the reflective eyes of some nocturnal creature scurrying across the road. The heat was oppressive, even with the windows down and the air conditioning blasting. Sweat trickled down my back, making my shirt cling uncomfortably to my skin. I'd been driving for hours, my eyes growing heavy with fatigue. The white lines on the road seemed to blur together, and I knew I needed to stop soon. It wasn't safe to keep going like this. As if answering my unspoken need, a sign appeared in the distance. Rest area 1 mile. I breathed a sigh of relief, already looking forward to stretching my legs and grabbing a quick bite to eat. The rest stop was small and deserted when I pulled in. Just a couple of vending machines and a dingy bathroom that looked like it hadn't seen a good cleaning in years. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an eerie glow over the empty parking lot. I parked my rig and climbed down, my joints creaking in protest after hours of sitting. As I made my way to the vending machines, a chill ran down my spine despite the oppressive heat. Something felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Maybe it was just the isolation, the knowledge that I was probably the only person for miles around. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to an overactive imagination fueled by too many late-night horror movies. I got myself a can of soda and a bag of chips, then leaned against the hood of my truck to eat. The night was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No crickets chirping, no distant hum of traffic, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the light breeze. I found myself straining to hear something, anything, to break the silence. That's when I saw her. At first I thought my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. A figure emerged from the tree line on the far side of the rest stop, stumbling and swaying like a drunk after last call. As she got closer, I could see it was a young woman, probably in her early 20s. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her face pale and streaked with what looked like blood and dirt in the harsh fluorescent light. "Hey, you all right?" I called out, setting my chips on the hood of the truck. She didn't answer, just kept moving towards me with a look of sheer terror on her face. Her eyes were wide, darting around as if expecting someone or something to leap out of the shadows at any moment. I started walking towards her, hands out in what I hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "It's okay," I said softly, trying to keep my voice calm despite the growing sense of dread in my gut. "I'm not gonna hurt you." As I got closer, I could see she was in bad shape. Cuts and bruises covered her exposed skin, and there was a particularly nasty gash on her forehead that was still oozing blood. Her hair was matted with leaves and twigs, as if she'd been running through the woods for hours. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible and shaky with fear. "Please help me." "Who did this to you?" I asked, looking around instinctively. But there was no one else in sight, just the empty parking lot, the silent vending machines, and the dark, foreboding woods beyond. "Please," she pleaded, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. "Just get me out of here." I nodded, making a split-second decision that would haunt me for years to come. "All right, come on. Let's get you to a hospital." I led her to my truck, helping her climb into the passenger seat. As I closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I scanned the tree line one last time before climbing in, but saw nothing but darkness. As I pulled out of the rest stop, I noticed my hands were trembling on the steering wheel. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, felt dangerous. But I couldn't just leave her there, could I? What kind of man would I be if I abandoned someone clearly in need of help? We drove in silence for a few miles, the only sound the rumble of the engine and the occasional sniffle from my passenger. I kept glancing over at her, trying to gauge her condition. She stared straight ahead, her body tense, as if ready to bolt at any moment. Finally, I couldn't take the silence anymore. "What's your name?" I asked gently. She flinched at the sound of my voice, then seemed to collect herself. "Lina," she said softly. "My name is Lina." "I'm Larry," I replied. "Can you tell me what happened, Lina? Who did this to you?" She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He's still out there. He'll find me." A chill ran down my spine at her words. "Who?" I pressed, glancing over at her again. "Who's after you?" He killed them," she choked out, her voice breaking. "My friends. We were camping, and he just..." She trailed off, dissolving into quiet sobs. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. This was way over my head. "All right," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to get to the police. They'll know what to do." As we drove, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. We were on a highway after all, but as the minutes ticked by, I realized the car behind us was matching our speed exactly, staying uncomfortably close. "Someone's following us," I muttered, more to myself than to Lena. She turned in her seat, looking out the back window. Her face, already pale, went ghost white. "It's him," she whispered. "It's got to be him." I didn't wait for confirmation. I floored it, the engine of my rig roaring as we accelerated. The car behind us sped up too, staying right on our tail. I wasn't armed, never felt the need to carry a gun on my runs. But in that moment I wished I had one. We were out in the middle of nowhere, no cell service to call for help. The nearest town was still a good 30 miles away. "Hang on," I growled, taking a sharp turn onto a narrow dirt road. The truck bounced and jolted, threatening to tip over with every bump. But I kept my foot on the gas, praying that the rough terrain would slow down our pursuer. For a heart-stopping moment, the headlights behind us grew closer. Then, mercifully, they began to fade, until finally, they disappeared altogether. I didn't slow down. I kept driving, my heart pounding in my chest, until we reached a small town. The welcome sign was a blur as we sped past, but I didn't care. I was looking for one thing and one thing only: a police station. The police station was a small, squat building on the main street of the town. I pulled up with a screech of tires, both Lena and I scrambling out of the truck before it had fully stopped. Inside, the place was empty except for a lone officer at the desk. He looked up as we burst in, surprise clear on his weathered face. "Can I help you?" he asked, rising from his chair. "This girl needs help," I said, practically dragging Lena to the counter. "Someone's after her." The officer took in Lena's appearance, his expression quickly shifting from surprise to concern. "All right, come with me," he said, leading us to a back room. Over the next few hours, we gave our statements. Lena told them everything, her voice shaky but determined. She and her friends had been camping in the woods when a man attacked their campsite. She'd managed to escape, but her friends, she didn't know what had happened to them. They took my statement too, thanking me for bringing her in. The officer in charge, a gruff man named Sergeant Winters, promised they'd do everything they could to catch the guy, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. This was a small-town police force, not equipped for a major manhunt. As dawn was breaking, I left the station. Lena was being taken to the hospital for treatment, and there was nothing more I could do. I was exhausted but wired, the adrenaline still coursing through my system. I drove to a nearby diner, desperate for coffee and a moment to process what had just happened. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of locals nursing cups of coffee at the counter. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting the guy to walk in any minute. I didn't know if Lena's attacker had seen me, if he knew who I was, or if he'd come after me next. The waitress, a friendly middle-aged woman named Barbara, noticed my unease.
"You all right, Dawn?"
she asked as she refilled my coffee cup. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just a long night," I replied, forcing a smile. "Well, you're safe here," she said, patting my shoulder. "Nothing bad ever happens in this town." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my stomach. I finished my coffee and headed back to my truck. I still had a delivery to make, and sitting around wasn't going to help anyone. As I climbed into the cab, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. I looked old, older than my 73 years. The events of the night had left their mark, adding new lines to my weathered face. I started the engine, the familiar rumble offering a small measure of comfort. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I couldn't help but wonder, was it over? Or was this just the beginning of something much worse? The rest of the drive to North Carolina was uneventful, but I couldn't relax. Every car that came up behind me made my heart race. Every time I stopped for gas or food, I found myself scanning the area, looking for any sign of danger. The delivery went smoothly, the furniture unloaded without a hitch. But as I started the long drive back to Texas, I couldn't stop thinking about Lena and her friends. What kind of person could do something like that? And was he still out there, looking for her? The miles rolled by, but I barely noticed the changing landscape. My mind was still back in that Arkansas rest stop, replaying the events of that night over and over. Could I have done something differently? Should I have noticed something was wrong earlier? I made it back to Texas without any more trouble. But the experience had changed me. I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability, the knowledge that danger could be lurking around any corner. For the next few weeks, I threw myself into work, taking on as many long-haul jobs as I could. I told myself it was because I needed the money, but deep down, I knew the truth. I was running, trying to outpace the memories of that night. But no matter how far or how fast I drove, I couldn't escape the nightmares. Every night I'd wake up in a cold sweat. The image of Lena's terrified face burned into my mind. Then, about a month after that fateful night, I got a call from Sergeant Winters. They'd caught the guy. Sergeant Winters' voice was gruff but tinged with satisfaction as he filled me in on the details. They'd found the man hiding out in a cabin in the woods, not far from where Lena and her friends had been camping. When they raided the place, he was covered in blood, surrounded by evidence linking him to the murders. I felt a sense of relief wash over me at the news. It was over. The monster was caught. But that relief was short-lived. "There's something else you should know, Mr. Lewis," Sergeant Winters said, his voice softening. "It's about Lena." My heart sank. Somehow I knew what he was going to say before the words left his mouth. "She didn't make it," he said quietly. "She died from her injuries a few days after you brought her in." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I gripped the phone tighter, trying to process what I'd just heard. Lena was dead. Despite everything, despite her escape and my intervention, she hadn't survived. "The doctors did everything they could," Sergeant Winters continued. "But her injuries were just too severe. Internal bleeding they couldn't stop." He paused, and I could hear him take a deep breath. "I want you to know, Mr. Lewis, that what you did, it mattered. You probably saved her life that night, at least for a little while, and because of you, she was able to give us the information we needed to catch this bastard. You did good." I mumbled something in response, but I couldn't tell you what. The rest of the conversation passed in a blur. When I hung up the phone, I felt numb. I'd been holding on to the hope that Lena had survived, that she'd recovered and was starting to rebuild her life. Finding out she was gone, it hit me harder than I expected. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room, staring out the window at the starless Texas sky, replaying every moment of that night in my head. Could I have done more? Driven faster? Gotten her to the hospital instead of the police station? Rationally, I knew there was nothing more I could have done. But that knowledge didn't ease the ache in my chest, the sense of failure that weighed on me. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to get back to normal. I took some time off work, telling my boss I needed to deal with some personal issues. He was understanding, probably assuming I was dealing with some health problem common to men my age. I spent my days puttering around my small house, trying to keep busy, but everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of that night. The keys to my truck, sitting on the kitchen counter, seemed to mock me. The CB radio in the corner, usually a comforting presence, now felt like a link to a world I wasn't sure I wanted to be part of anymore. My neighbors, good people who'd known me for years, noticed the change. They'd stop by with casseroles or invitations to backyard barbecues, their eyes filled with concern. I'd paste on a smile and make small talk, but I could tell they knew something was off. One evening, as I sat on my front porch watching the sunset, my next-door neighbor Bill came over. He was a retired cop, and I'd always appreciated his no-nonsense attitude. "Larry," he said, settling into the chair next to me. "What's eating you?" For a moment I considered brushing him off with some vague excuse. But something in his tone, the genuine concern in his eyes, made me reconsider. So I told him. Everything. The rest stop, Lena. The chase. The aftermath. As I spoke, I felt a weight lifting off my chest. When I finished, Bill was quiet for a long moment. "That's a hell of a thing," he said finally. "But let me tell you something, Larry. You did everything right. You saw someone in trouble and you helped. That's more than a lot of people would do." "But she died," I said, the words catching in my throat. Bill nodded solemnly. "Yeah, she did. And that's a tragedy. But it's not on you. The only person responsible for her death is the man who hurt her. You gave her a chance, Larry. You gave her hope. Don't forget that." We sat in silence as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. Bill's words echoed in my mind, offering a perspective I hadn't considered. As the stars began to appear in the sky, I felt something shift inside me. Bill's words had struck a chord, offering a perspective I hadn't allowed myself to consider. "You think I should get back on the road?" I asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between us. Bill turned to me, a half smile on his weathered face. "I think you need to do what feels right for you, Larry. But I also think that running from what happened isn't going to help. Sometimes the only way past something is through it." I nodded, mulling over his words. The thought of getting back behind the wheel of my truck filled me with a mixture of anxiety and longing. The open road had been my home for so long. Could I really walk away from it? That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made my decision. I couldn't let fear dictate the rest of my life. I was a trucker, had been for over 4 decades, and I wasn't about to let one terrible night change that. The next morning I called my boss and told him I was ready to come back to work. He sounded relieved, and I realized how worried he must have been about me. A week later I found myself back in the cab of my truck, preparing for a long haul from Texas to Montana. As I went through my pre-trip routine, checking the tires and inspecting the engine, I felt a familiar sense of anticipation building in my chest. The first few hours on the road were tense. Every rest stop I passed made my heart race, memories of that night flashing through my mind. But as the miles rolled by, I felt myself starting to relax. The rhythm of the road, the hum of the engine, the ever-changing landscape outside my window, it all worked to soothe my frayed nerves. By the time I crossed into Oklahoma, I was feeling more like myself than I had in weeks. The open road stretched out before me, full of possibility, but I wasn't naive enough to think that everything was back to normal. I kept a more watchful eye on my surroundings, always alert for any sign of danger. I'd also made some changes. I now carried a gun, properly licensed and secured in my truck. I'd taken some self-defense classes, determined never to feel as helpless as I had that night. And I'd installed a top-of-the-line security system in my rig, complete with cameras and a panic button linked directly to local law enforcement. As I drove, I found my thoughts drifting to Lena. I hoped that wherever she was at peace, and I silently vowed to honor her memory by staying vigilant, by being ready to help if I ever encountered someone else in trouble. The trip to Montana was uneventful, as was the return journey. With each mile, each successful delivery, I felt my confidence returning. I was still a bit jumpy at night, still wary of isolated rest stops, but I was coping. It's been years now since that fateful night in Arkansas. I'm still on the road, still hauling loads across this vast country of ours. I've seen a lot in my time, both beautiful and terrible, but nothing quite compares to the horror of that night. I still think about Lena often. Sometimes when I'm driving late at night and the road ahead is empty, I can almost see her ghost in my headlights, stumbling out of the darkness. In those moments, I say a quiet prayer for her and her friends, hoping they've found the peace that eluded them in life. The experience changed me, there's no denying that. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the potential dangers lurking in the shadows. But it also reinforced something I've always believed, that we have a responsibility to help each other, even when it's scary or inconvenient. I've had a few more adventures since then, some that have tested my resolve and others that have restored my faith in humanity. But that's the thing about life on the road. You never know what's waiting around the next bend. As I write this, I'm parked at a truck stop in Nevada, preparing for another long haul. The desert stretches out around me, vast and empty under the star-filled sky. In a few hours, I'll be back on the road, my headlights cutting through the darkness, carrying me towards whatever lies ahead. This life isn't for everyone. It can be lonely, dangerous, and unpredictable. But for me, even after everything that's happened, there's no place I'd rather be than behind the wheel, chasing the horizon. So if you're ever out on the highway late at night and you see an old trucker giving you a wave, that might just be me. And if you ever find yourself in trouble on some lonely stretch of road, don't lose hope. There are still good people out there ready to help. Just be careful who you trust in the dark.